Hi folks, Dr. Pulsifer here. And because I wasn't sure about how many people would actually be looking at YouTube on July 4th, I decided to do something special since Monday is my normal day to issue one of my 2 weekly videos. And I'm going to talk about my view of the war in Ukraine as of July 4th. Now, why? Well, I'm interested in the independence of a young nation. It is, after all, Independence Day in the United States. And it's had a fascination for me. And of course, I do think in terms of game design as well. I'm not an expert in modern warfare, but I do have a PhD in military history. I don't claim to be a prognosticator or a futurist. So I've been watching lots of YouTube channels and reading a lot about what's going on. And I have to say, I just have an urge to get all this out of me and show my take on it. So, first of all, the Russian invasion of Ukraine is a war. It's not a special military operation. It's an unjustified invasion. The notion that there are a lot of Nazis in Ukraine is ridiculous, especially when you consider the president is a Jew and won very substantially in the last runoff election. Now, I don't understand why the Russians differentiate between special military operation and war. It's clearly a war, but if it had worked the way the Russians expected it to, which was Ukraine surrendering in a few days, then special military operation might have fit the situation. Not being a war seems to prevent Russia from using conscripts in Ukraine and from calling up reserves. But my observation is they may not have the equipment for a lot of conscripts and reserves. You know, troops without equipment are very unuseful. What are Russia's goals? Well, we don't know for sure because they've never said outright. But I think Putin wants to be the man who restores the Russian Empire. And of course, the Russian Empire has existed for centuries, going back to Peter the Great and even earlier. It's something that Russia just does. And Russia believes they're justified in getting whatever they want. Whatever they think is necessary for their security, everybody else should do, even if it means essentially taking over their country. Russia doesn't understand that wanting something does not give you the right to have it. Now, given how the initial attack was organized, the Russians clearly expected the Ukrainians to surrender in a few days, as they would have in 2014 to a full-scale invasion, because they didn't have an army to speak of at that point. The lack of long-term supplies, the equipment that was taken along with the invasion forces for controlling surrendered territory and celebrating success, and in many other ways, clearly they expected the war to last a short time. And this is not an unusual notion in the history of warfare, of course, but it seemed to make sense to the Russians because they feel that the Ukrainians are just Russians. Unfortunately for them, Ukrainians in their 30s do not remember when Ukraine was part of Russia. So probably more than half the population has never been part of Russia. And even the 8 years between 2014 and 2022 have made a lot of difference in that respect. So the outcome might be a treaty that temporarily ends the warfare if the Russians get enough of what they want and they can claim that Donbass has been liberated. And the Russians, of course, routinely ignore treaties they don't like because to them it's their right to do so because security is a one-way street. If they think they need it for their security, it doesn't matter. Anything else doesn't matter. So they can declare success, make peace, and attack again in a while. Now, the way the war has gone has been quite strange. It's not what experts expected. The Russians tried traditional armor tactics, although they were incompetent logistically, and they failed to use combined arms, and that didn't work. Among other things, there are too many man-portable ways to knock out tanks these days. In other words, you can carry something on your shoulder and knock out a tank that's quite a long distance away. They also failed to gain air supremacy, which may be because of man-portable anti-aircraft devices and anti-air missile batteries. And of course, drones, and especially smaller drones, even off-the-shelf drones, have played a big part in reconnaissance and combat, and the Ukrainians seem to have a leg up over the Russians in that respect. So things have just not gone the way people expect, experts expect, and they have not gone well for the Russians. So their attack on Kiev failed, although perhaps it was a close call. They took Gostomel Airport, for example, with paratroopers brought in helicopters, but before they could get large numbers of planes in with vehicles and other reinforcements, the Ukrainian artillery put a lot of holes in the airways so that the planes couldn't land. So ultimately they withdrew from around Kiev and lied about it being a goodwill gesture, and they switched to traditional Russian artillery tactics in Donbass, in the eastern part of the country. And that's enabled them to slowly advance. And I say slowly because if you look at a map from shortly after the invasion started, and now the Russians have gained some territory in the east, but they pulled out of Kiev. It's not even a wash. I think the Ukrainians would be ahead in that respect. So the Russians are using what has become a traditional annihilation strategy. In Chechnya and in Georgia and in Aleppo in Syria, they bombarded cities until nothing was left and the population was dead or had gone somewhere else. Now you can do this when artillery is your strongest arm. You just keep blasting away. You can use missiles as well. It doesn't have to be accurate. It doesn't matter whether civilians are killed or not. In fact, killing some civilians is good because then they'll leave. And long-range missiles often miss their targets, especially Russian missiles. They don't have a lot of precise targeting. They like to talk about it, but they don't have it, or they've already used a lot of it. So the Russians repeatedly say they don't target civilians, and maybe that's technically true because they don't really target anything. They just blast away. Of course, sometimes winning is a matter of perception more than reality, and Moscow has never actually said what winning amounts to. Now, clearly they expected to have a puppet government installed soon after the war started. That looks very unlikely now. So liberating Donbass looks a much more practical win if they don't feel that they can continue the war. There are complications. Russia does not have the troops to occupy the whole of a hostile Ukraine. And given Russia's track record so far, bombarding civilians, all the terrible deaths in Bucha and other places, Ukrainian hostility is very strong. There are a lot of Ukrainians who used to be kind of pro-Russian who aren't anymore. The Ukrainian partisans have been active in the newly occupied areas. The Ukrainians want the orcs out of Ukraine, and that's what they call the Russians, orcs. And if you're familiar with the Lord of the Rings, you know what contempt that brings out. Now, what about exhaustion, which is how this may end? Putin bets that Western support for Ukraine will flag, that arms supplies will be insufficient, that the European dependence on Russian energy will pressure the Western powers, at least some of them, into pressuring Ukraine to give up territory for an armistice. Now I say armistice, not peace, because the war will only stop for a while, not end, because Putin and his group intend to rebuild the Russian Empire, and they have to get Ukraine. They've got Belarus, they need to get Ukraine, and then they'll go on to the Baltic states and Poland and so forth. So the Ukrainians have to hope that the Russians will run out of the sinews of war. In other words, they'll run out of our ammunition, more or less, while Western arms continue to arrive. This is not about manpower, it's about arms and ammunition. The World War II rule of thumb was military manpower is approximately 10% of the population. That's 4.4 million for Ukraine as of the start of the war, and vastly more for Russia, which has more than 3 times as many people. So despite awful casualties, they won't run out of bodies, but they might run out of manufactured materials that are needed for war. Now, we can briefly address Russian government claims, which are generally nonsense. They often make assertions that are clearly not true, and like the Soviets, only perhaps worse, they don't give a damn about truth. Why they think they don't look really bad when they say the Moskva suffered an accident and sank, rather than that Ukraine got a lucky missile hit and sank it, is beyond me. Or how they say their withdrawal from Snake Island recently was a goodwill gesture, when in fact they were fleeing from Ukrainian artillery, which was leveling everything on that little island. The Kiev withdrawal was called a goodwill gesture, and that was obvious bullshit as well. What about China? Well, China is opposed to the USA. China wants Taiwan. Could it play a part? Yes, they can help Russia evade sanctions. They can buy Russian oil and so on, and Russian grain, although the transport of that from Russia to China is very difficult. But China has its own problems, especially economic and geographical. A lot of people nowadays say that the Chinese economy is collapsing and it's not going to recover. And there are lots of reasons for that. Moreover, Chinese economy relies heavily on exports, the old made in China. But if they come to blows with the USA or even just suffer sanctions that are similar to the ones on Russia, those exports stop. And that means the Chinese economy stops. China also relies on vast imports of food and energy, and if it comes to blows, those imports stop. They're very vulnerable. Energy especially goes through the Straits of Hormuz, it goes past India, it goes through the Straits of Malacca. A few warships can stop those. The Chinese Navy is not going to project that far. What about Belarus? Well, it's hard to believe Belarus would be foolish enough to attack Ukraine. And of course, Lukashenko claimed recently that the Ukrainians had attacked Belarus, but that's nonsense. Why would they do that? What do they have to gain? Nor do they have the means. But Lukashenko is a clown, so who knows? Clearly, Russia wants to reunify with Belarus, and Putin has talked about this, just as they want to reunify with Ukraine. In the end, war is not always rational. What about the world? Well, the Russian blockade of Ukraine and sanctions against Russia are going to result in widespread famine and many, many deaths. And of course, no, it isn't Ukrainian sea mines that are causing the problem, it's the Russian Navy. Only idiots don't know where their own mines are located, so the Ukrainian sea mines don't keep the Ukrainian ships from traveling, it's the Russian Navy. Now, the famine is going to lead to widespread unrest and revolution in much of the developing world. It's already happened in Sri Lanka, it's happening other places, and it's just getting started. Inflation worldwide is a post-pandemic reaction, but now it's exacerbated by the energy shortage, and it all will get much worse. It's very grim. Now, when a government is losing favor in its country, one way to boost its standing is conflict with a foreign power. Or if they're already in conflict, as the Russians are with the Ukrainians, escalation is more likely to be popular than making an unfavorable peace. Imagine what would happen to the Russian government if they bailed out of the pre-2014 borders. In other words, left Ukraine entirely. Would the government stand? I don't know. The only avenues left to Russia are mobilization or use of nuclear weapons, if their current way of doing things isn't going to succeed in the end. Now, mobilization may not be practical for lack of equipment for new units, and the Russians have chosen different ways to attract reservists to service with big money. Russia may employ tactical nukes. I don't know what the West would do. It might depend on the targets. I suspect a great many minds in the West are considering the possibilities. If they use full-scale nukes, as in blow Kiev to kingdom come, then I think, or at least I hope, the West would attack Russia without nukes, in the air and on the sea, first outside of Russia, then inside of Russia, if Russia doesn't stop nuking Ukraine. Of course, if Russia nukes the West, that's more or less going to start World War III and civilization ends worldwide. And that's always a danger. So what the Russians are trying to do is nuclear blackmail. Many in the Russian government talk about using nukes as though it was a reasonable choice. Once again, in the end, war is not always rational. They're trying to leverage their nuclear capability. We have to face it. If Russia had no nukes, there would be no war in Ukraine. Because if they'd tried it, then the United States and Europe would have set up a no-fly zone and would have done much more than they have, because they would be willing to engage the Russians directly because the Russians had no nukes. The best outcome from Western viewpoint is replacement of Putin with a more reasonable government who would cut their losses, but is that likely to happen? Not from what I've heard. Maybe Putin won't be there anymore, but the people around him have the same apparent goals that he does. Now we get to games. Well, obviously you can have tactical games that explore the big changes in the nature of warfare, the failure of armor, the man-portable weapons, the failure of the Russians to gain air supremacy, and so on. Then, of course, we have the operational games where we see the symbols on the maps of the battalions and regiments and brigades. In other words, a typical hex and counter game. But it doesn't look like a very interesting one because there's so little movement. It reminds me, watching the map, of World War I. Of course, there are many World War I games. Now, a grand strategic game, this is so one-sided as to make a game difficult. Russia is so much smaller than Europe, let alone the United States. It's David against Goliath. So, we end with weapons or ammo exhaustion of one side or both sides. That seems to be the fate of what's going to happen. Thanks for listening.